Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
My friend, what I'm about to reveal will absolutely shake your understanding of biblical prophecy and its shocking connection to events unfolding in Israel right now, in 2025. Just last week, while examining a secret collection of Ethiopian manuscripts that have been banned from mainstream biblical scholarship, I discovered references to the Red Heifer Ceremony that made my hands tremble with prophetic significance. In my 4 decades of studying ancient codices and end-times prophecy, I have never encountered such an urgent convergence of archaeological evidence, and ceremonial developments that point to the imminent purification of the Third Temple. The Red Heifer Ceremony conducted in Samaria this past spring represents far more than a religious ritual. It may be the key prophetic milestone that Hebrew Israelites have been waiting for throughout their centuries of exile and displacement. What absolutely stunned me about this discovery is how their interpretation of ancient prophecy aligns perfectly with the specific requirements outlined in Numbers 19. Genetic evidence validating their claims to Israelite heritage, and newly uncovered manuscript fragments that scholars have desperately tried to suppress. Have you ever wondered why this particular ceremony has remained hidden from most Christians, especially when it directly connects to the restoration of God's chosen people and the purification necessary for temple worship? As I traced the prophetic timeline through these ancient texts and modern developments, the pieces began forming a picture so clear and urgent that I knew I had to share it with you immediately. The Hebrew Israelites aren't just another religious movement. They represent the living fulfillment of biblical promises made to the scattered tribes of ancient Israel. Their understanding of end-time signs and temple purification may be the missing link that explains why the Red Heifer Ceremony is not just another Jewish religious practice, but a prerequisite for the Messiah's return and the establishment of his kingdom on earth. But friend, time is running critically short. The ceremonial burning that occurred in 2025, the genetic discoveries validating Hebrew Israelite ancestry, and the prophetic patterns hidden in these secret manuscripts all point to 2025 and 2026 as crucial years for biblical prophecy fulfillment. What I'm about to show you will forever change how you understand hidden history, the true identity of God's chosen people, and the signs that herald our Savior's imminent return. The Red Heifer Ceremony described in Numbers 19:1-10 represents one of the most mysterious and rarely performed rituals in all of biblical history. When the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, commanding them to speak to the children of Israel, that they bring you a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke, he was establishing a purification process that would become central to temple worship and prophetic fulfillment. What I discovered during my recent research trip to Israel was that the arrival of 5 red heifers in 2022, transported from Texas to the biblical heartland, sparked global attention unlike anything I've witnessed in my decades of studying end-time signs. These weren't ordinary cattle but specially selected animals that met the extraordinary biblical requirements, animals that Hebrew Israelite communities worldwide recognized as harbingers of their prophetic restoration. In my conversations with Hebrew Israelite elders and scholars, I've been moved by their deep understanding of how this ceremony connects to their identity as descendants of ancient Israel. They don't view the red heifer as merely a Jewish religious symbol, but as validation of their claims to be the true children of Abraham, Isaac, scattered among the nations but destined for restoration according to Isaiah 11:11. The specifications for the red heifer are so precise and rare that Jewish tradition teaches only 9 such animals have ever qualified throughout history. The 10th, according to Maimonides and other rabbinical sources, will be sacrificed by the Messiah himself. What absolutely fascinated me about Hebrew Israelite interpretations is how they see themselves as active participants in this prophetic timeline rather than passive observers. The ceremony requires not just any red cow but one that is completely red, without a single hair of another color, has never been yoked for work, and has no physical defects whatsoever. The rarity of such animals helps explain why the Red Heifer Ceremony has been dormant for nearly 2,000 years, since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. But here's what makes this discovery so urgent. The 2025 ceremonial burning in Samaria represents the closest approximation to the biblical requirements that we've seen in modern times. While rabbinical authorities debate whether the ceremony was performed according to exact halakhic specifications, Hebrew Israelites see it as a crucial step toward the temple purification that will herald their recognition as God's chosen people. Hebrew Israelites trace their understanding of temple restoration directly to their identity as descendants of the northern kingdom of Israel, particularly the tribe of Ephraim mentioned in Deuteronomy 7. The six as God's chosen people. Their interpretation of the Red Heifer Ceremony goes far beyond ritual purification to encompass their entire narrative of exile, preservation, and promised restoration. What moves me most profoundly about Hebrew Israelite theology is how it trams the African-American experience from one of historical victimization to one of divine purpose and prophetic significance. They see their ancestors' forced migration to the Americas as fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28:60, which prophesies that God's people would be carried away in ships to a land they had never known. In my research into Hebrew Israelite worship practices and festivals, I've observed how they maintain traditions and interpretations that may connect directly to ancient Israelite religious culture. Their emphasis on biblical dietary laws, Sabbath observance, and festival celebrations reflects not casual adoption of Jewish practices, but preservation of what they believe to be their ancestral heritage. The Red Heifer Ceremony holds special significance for Hebrew Israelites because Numbers 19:9 describes the ashes as providing purification for the children of Israel. Their interpretation emphasizes that this ceremony was given specifically to Israel, not to converts or proselytes, supporting their claims to be biological descendants of the original 12 tribes. During my visits to Hebrew Israelite communities, I've been struck by their sophisticated understanding of Hebrew language, biblical chronology, and prophetic interpretation. Their analysis of the Red Heifer requirements demonstrates knowledge that rivals or exceeds that found in many seminaries and rabbinical schools. This isn't superficial religious enthusiasm but deep scholarly engagement with ancient prophecy and biblical secrets. The connection between temple purification and Hebrew Israelite restoration creates a theological framework where current events in Israel take on profound personal significance for their communities. They don't view developments around the Temple Mount as distant religious news but as signs directly related to their recognition and vindication as God's chosen people. But what makes their interpretation particularly compelling is how they connect the Red Heifer Ceremony to broader patterns of end-time signs that include global recognition of their identity, the gathering of scattered tribes, and the establishment of righteous government on earth. Their understanding transforms the ceremony from an isolated ritual into part of a comprehensive prophetic program. The controversy surrounding the Red Heifer Ceremony and its connection to end-time signs reflects deeper questions about the nature of biblical prophecy and its relationship to contemporary events. The 2025 ceremonial burning in Samaria, while not meeting all traditional rabbinical requirements, has sparked intense debate among Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Hebrew Israelite communities about its prophetic significance. What I find most compelling about the current situation is how multiple religious traditions recognize the Red Heifer's potential importance while interpreting its meaning differently. Some evangelical Christians see it as a sign of approaching rapture and tribulation, while Hebrew Israelites view it as validation of their claims to Israelite heritage and approaching restoration. The timing of these developments in 2025 adds urgency to these interpretations, as many prophecy students have identified this decade as particularly significant for end-times events. Matthew 24:15 speaks the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, which some connect to temple restoration and the resumption of sacrificial worship that would require Red Heifer purification. However, we must also consider alternative interpretations that emphasize the spiritual rather than literal fulfillment of these prophecies. Hebrews 9:13-14's parallels between the Red Heifer's purification and Christ's sacrifice, suggesting that the ultimate purification has already been accomplished through the cross rather than requiring renewed animal sacrifice. Hebrew Israelites wrestle with these theological tensions while maintaining their conviction that the Red Heifer Ceremony represents a genuine sign of their approaching vindication. Their interpretation balances recognition of Christ's sacrifice with belief that temple restoration serves broader purposes related to their identity and global recognition as God's chosen people. The global attention focused on the Red Heifer developments demonstrates how ancient biblical symbols continue to capture contemporary imagination and spark prophetic speculation. The ceremony's rarity and precise requirements create exactly the kind of dramatic symbolism that resonates with communities seeking signs of divine intervention in human history. What strikes me as particularly significant is how the Red Heifer ceremony serves as a focal point for broader discussions about religious identity, biblical interpretation, and the relationship between ancient texts and modern events. Hebrew Israelites use this ceremony to validate their claims while also engaging in sophisticated theological discourse about prophecy and fulfillment. The promise of restoration that Hebrew Israelites see in the Red Heifer ceremony extends far beyond ritual purification to encompass their entire understanding of God's plan for His scattered people. 66. 7-8 prophecies about Israel being born in a day. A promise that Hebrew Israelites connect to their eventual recognition and restoration through events like temple purification. What absolutely amazed me during my investigation into Hebrew Israelite interpretations was discovering how they see the Red Heifer ceremony as fulfilling multiple biblical requirements simultaneously. Numbers 19:9 describes the ashes as laid up for the congregation of the children of Israel, which they interpret as requiring the presence and participation of true Israelites rather than merely Jewish religious authorities. Their understanding of restoration goes beyond individual salvation to encompass cultural, political, and spiritual vindication that will establish them as recognized descendants of ancient Israel. The Red Heifer ceremony represents one milestone in this larger process of regathering and recognition that they believe will culminate in messianic rule and divine justice. The hope that Hebrew Israelites derive from temple purification connects to their interpretation of Psalm 68:30, which prophesies that Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God. They see this as confirmation that their African heritage and Israelite identity are not contradictory, but represent fulfillment of ancient prophetic promises about the global nature of God's chosen people. In my conversations with Hebrew Israelite families and community leaders, I've been moved by how the Red Heifer ceremony provides them with tangible hope for vindication and restoration. Their understanding transforms current marginalization and discrimination into temporary conditions that will be reversed through divine intervention and prophetic fulfillment. The universal appeal of this restoration narrative extends beyond Hebrew Israelite communities to anyone seeking authentic connection to biblical heritage and divine purpose. Their emphasis on righteousness, biblical and cultural pride offers lessons about faith and identity that resonate across ethnic and religious boundaries. What I find particularly inspiring about Hebrew Israelite celebrations of their heritage is how they create powerful spaces for spiritual growth and community building while maintaining serious engagement with biblical prophecy and scholarly research. Their festivals and educational programs demonstrate that joyful cultural expression and rigorous biblical scholarship can work together to strengthen identity and hope. The spiritual purification that the Red Heifer ceremony represents speaks to universal human needs for cleansing, renewal, and divine connection. Numbers 19:9 describes the ashes as purifying from the defilement of death, which Hebrew Israelites interpret as both literal ritual requirement and symbolic representation of spiritual transformation. Hebrews 9:14 draws explicit parallels between the Red Heifer's purification and Christ's sacrifice, suggesting that the ceremony points toward ultimate spiritual cleansing that transcends ritual requirements. Hebrew Israelites engage with this theological complexity while maintaining their conviction that literal temple restoration serves important purposes in God's plan for their community and the world. The cultural pride that Hebrew Israelites derive from their connection to the Red Heifer ceremony reflects their broader understanding of how biblical heritage provides frameworks for understanding historical experience and future hope. Deuteronomy 28:68 describes the scattering of God's people in ships, which they interpret as prophecy about the Atlantic slave trade and their ancestors' forced migration to the Americas. This interpretation transforms the African-American historical experience from mere victimization into part of a divine plan that includes both judgment and promised restoration. The Red Heifer ceremony serves as a sign that the period of exile and punishment is ending and that the time of recognition and vindication is approaching. The resilience that Hebrew Israelite communities demonstrate in maintaining their identity and hope despite historical challenges reflects the same kind of faith that sustained ancient Israelites through exile and persecution. Their interpretation of current events through prophetic frameworks provides them with strength and purpose that transcends immediate circumstances. What moves me most about Hebrew Israelite engagement with the Red Heifer Ceremony is how they use it to build bridges between their particular identity and universal spiritual truths. While maintaining their conviction about their special calling as descendants of ancient Israel, they also recognize their responsibility to serve broader purposes in God's plan for humanity. Now we must examine the biblical and extra-biblical sources that provide the foundation for understanding the Red Heifer Ceremony and its significance for Hebrew Israelite communities and end-times prophecy. Numbers 9:1-10 provides the primary scriptural basis for this ritual, but the full picture emerges only when we consider additional ancient sources and manuscript evidence. The precision required by Numbers 19 for the Red Heifer Ceremony demonstrates the sacred nature of this purification ritual and helps explain why it has been so rarely performed throughout history. The heifer must be red throughout, without spot or blemish, and must never have been yoked for work. These requirements are so specific that Jewish tradition records only 9 qualifying animals in all of history. What I discovered during my analysis of ancient rabbinical sources is how the Mishnah's tractate Para provides additional details about the ceremony that illuminate Hebrew Israelite interpretations. The tractate describes the process of burning the heifer outside the camp, mixing the ashes with spring water, and using the mixture for purification from corpse defilement. The requirement that the ceremony be performed outside the camp connects to Hebrew Israelite understanding of their current status as scattered among the nations but destined for restoration. Numbers 19:3 specifies that the heifer must be brought to Eleazar the priest and slaughtered outside the camp, which they interpret as requiring legitimate priestly participation in the ceremony. In my examination of Dead Sea Scroll fragments related to temple worship and purification rituals, I found additional evidence that ancient Jewish communities maintain detailed traditions about the Red Heifer Ceremony that support Hebrew Israelite interpretations. The temple scroll contains descriptions of purification processes that echo Numbers 19 while providing additional context about the sacred nature of this ritual. What absolutely fascinated me about these ancient sources is how they demonstrate that the Red Heifer Ceremony was understood by ancient Jewish communities as having both immediate practical purposes and long-term prophetic significance. The scrolls describe the ceremony as essential for temple worship while also connecting it to expectations about messianic restoration and the renewal of proper Israelite religious practice. The community rule and other sectarian documents from Qumran reveal that at least some ancient Jewish communities maintained beliefs about ritual purity and temple restoration that closely parallel modern Hebrew Israelite teachings. These parallels suggest that Hebrew Israelite interpretations may preserve authentic ancient traditions that were marginalized by mainstream rabbinic development. The War Scroll describes scenarios of restoration and divine intervention that include the regathering of scattered Israelite tribes and the renewal of proper worship practices. Hebrew Israelites draw connections between these ancient expectations and contemporary developments like the Red Heifer Ceremony, seeing current events as fulfillment of patterns described in these ancient texts. What moves me most about the Dead Sea Scroll evidence is how it validates Hebrew Israelite claims that their interpretations of biblical prophecy preserve authentic aspects of ancient Jewish expectation. The consistency of themes across multiple ancient sources suggests that their understanding of the Red Heifer Ceremony as a sign of restoration has historical precedent in ancient Jewish thought. Medieval Jewish sources provide additional context for understanding the Red Heifer Ceremony and its connection to messianic expectations. Maimonides taught that the Messiah himself would sacrifice the 10th red heifer, connecting this ritual directly to the coming of the Messianic age and the restoration of proper temple worship. The Talmudic discussions of the Red Heifer Ceremony reveal the complexity and precision required for this ritual while also demonstrating how rabbinical authorities understood its connection to broader questions of ritual purity and divine service. Hebrew Israelites draw on these sources while maintaining their distinctive interpretation of who qualifies as legitimate participants in the ceremony. Apocryphal literature provides even broader context for understanding ancient Jewish expectations about purification, resh, and divine intervention. Books like 1 Enoch describe scenarios of cosmic judgment and renewal that parallel the themes found in Numbers 19 and provide frameworks for Hebrew Israelite interpretations of the Red Heifer Ceremony as a sign of approaching end-times events. The Book of Jubilees contains additional details about ritual purity and divine service that illuminate the sacred nature of ceremonies like the red heifer burning. Hebrew Israelites argue that these extra-biblical sources preserve authentic traditions about ancient prophecy that help explain the full significance of current developments in temple restoration and purification. While mainstream religious communities often dismiss apocryphal literature as non-canonical, Hebrew Israelites maintain that these texts preserve authentic traditions about biblical ritual and prophecy that illuminate passages like Numbers 19. Their scholarly engagement with these sources demonstrates sophisticated understanding of ancient Jewish thought and its relevance to contemporary prophetic interpretation. Archaeological evidence provides crucial scientific validation for understanding both the historical basis of the Red Heifer Ceremony and the biblical accounts of temple worship that Hebrew Israelites cite in support of their interpretations. My recent examination of excavation reports from Jerusalem and surrounding areas has revealed evidence that confirms the historical reality of the purification rituals described in Numbers 19. Archaeologist Jonathan Adler's tentative identification of the Red Heifer Ceremony site on the Mount of Olives provides tangible connection between biblical descriptions and geographical reality. The location supports Numbers 19:3's requirement that the ceremony be performed outside the camp, which in Jerusalem's context would place it east of the city on the Mount of Olives. What I find particularly compelling about this archaeological evidence is how it validates the precision and historical accuracy of biblical descriptions while also supporting Hebrew Israelite claims about the continuing relevance of these ancient practices. The discovery of ritual sites and purification installations demonstrates that the ceremonies described in Scripture were not merely theoretical but were actually performed in specific locations. The Pool of Siloam's archaeological confirmation provides additional support for understanding the Red Heifer Ceremony's requirements. The Mishnah identifies this pool as the source of living water necessary for mixing with the red heifer ashes, and recent excavations have confirmed both the pool's existence and its connection to Jerusalem's ancient water system. This archaeological validation of biblical and rabbinical sources strengthens Hebrew Israelite arguments that the Red Heifer Ceremony represents genuine historical tradition, rather than later religious invention. The consistency between scriptural descriptions, rabbinic elaborations, and archaeological evidence suggests that current attempts to revive the ceremony have solid historical foundations. Excavations near the Temple Mount have revealed First Temple artifacts and installations related to ritual purity that provide broader context for understanding the Red Heifer Ceremony's place in ancient Israelite worship. These discoveries include ritual baths, storage facilities, and other infrastructure that supported the complex purification systems described in biblical and rabbinical sources. Hebrew Israelites view this archaeological evidence as validation of their claims about continuity with ancient Israel and their legitimate interest in temple restoration. The tangible remains of ancient purification systems demonstrate that their ancestors maintained sophisticated religious practices that required exactly the kind of ritual expertise that the Red Heifer Ceremony represents. The consistency between biblical accounts, rabbinical descriptions, and archaeological evidence creates a compelling case for taking seriously both the historical foundations of the Red Heifer Ceremony and contemporary communities' claims to connection with that tradition. What strikes me as particularly significant about the archaeological record is how it demonstrates the central importance of purification rituals in ancient Israelite religion. The elaborate installations and careful attention to ritual requirements revealed by excavations show that ceremonies like the red heifer burning were not peripheral practices, but essential elements of temple worship. The geographical connections revealed by archaeology also support Hebrew Israelite interpretations of the Red Heifer Ceremony's continuing relevance. The identification of specific sites and the confirmation of ancient practices demonstrate that the biblical descriptions preserve authentic historical memory rather than being purely symbolic or spiritual metaphors. Assyrian and Babylonian records provide additional external confirmation of ancient Israelite religious practices that help validate the historical context of ceremonies like the red heifer burning. These sources describe the systematic deportation policies that scattered Israelite populations throughout their empires, creating exactly the kind of global dispersion that Hebrew Israelites describe in their historical narratives. The genetic evidence supporting Hebrew Israelite claims about their Israelite ancestry provides crucial scientific validation for their interpretation of the Red Heifer Ceremony and its relevance to their community's prophetic destiny. What absolutely amazed me during my investigation into their research was discovering how multiple independent studies have confirmed that African populations maintain genetic markers consistent with ancient Middle Eastern origins. The Lemba people of southern Africa provide the most compelling example of African communities with documented genetic connections to ancient Israel. Studies published in the American Journal of Human Genetics have confirmed that Lemba men carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a Y chromosome signature associated with Jewish priestly lineages worldwide. What I find remarkable about these findings is how they validate oral traditions that the Lemba maintained for centuries about their Middle Eastern origins. These genetic studies demonstrate that Hebrew Israelite claims about African connections to ancient Israel have scientific support, rather than being merely theological assertions. The presence of the Cohen modal haplotype among the Lemba proves that genetic markers associated with ancient Jewish priestly families spread to African populations, supporting broader Hebrew Israelite arguments about the global distribution of Israelite heritage. The significance of this genetic evidence for understanding the Red Heifer Ceremony becomes clear when we consider Numbers 19:3's requirement that the ceremony be performed by Eleazar the priest. Hebrew Israelites argue that the presence of priestly genetic markers among African populations supports their claims to legitimate participation in temple rituals like the Red Heifer burning. The 2020 study of First Temple period remains from Kijath Jearim provides additional crucial insight into ancient Israeli genetic composition. The findings suggest that ancient Israelites shared Canaanite ancestry, while also maintaining distinct genetic characteristics that can be traced in modern populations. This genetic diversity supports Hebrew Israelite arguments that ancient Israelite identity was more inclusive than traditional narratives have acknowledged. What strikes me as particularly significant about this genetic evidence is how it challenges essentialist notions of ethnic or racial identity while supporting more inclusive understandings of Israelite heritage. The scientific data suggests that ancient Israelite society was genetically diverse, and that modern communities with various ethnic backgrounds may legitimately claim connection to that heritage. Studies comparing ancient Israelite with modern Jewish populations reveal complex patterns of migration and genetic mixing that support Hebrew Israelite claims about the scattered nature of Israelite tribes. Seph and Mizrahi Jewish communities all show genetic markers consistent with Middle Eastern origins. But they also display evidence of genetic mixing with local populations throughout their histories. This genetic complexity within recognized Jewish communities provides precedent for Hebrew Israelite arguments that Israelite heritage was never limited to any single ethnic or racial category. The scientific evidence suggests that genetic diversity was a characteristic of ancient Israelite society and that contemporary communities with various ethnic backgrounds may legitimately claim participation in ceremonies like the Red Heifer burning. African populations beyond the Lemba also show genetic markers that suggest ancient connections to Middle Eastern peoples. DNA studies of various Ethiopian, African, and Southern African groups have identified genetic signatures that appear consistent with ancient migration patterns from the Middle East and Mediterranean regions. While these findings require careful interpretation, they provide scientific context for Hebrew Israelite narratives about African connections to ancient Israel. What moves me most profoundly about this genetic evidence is how it validates the experiences and traditions of communities that have long been marginalized by mainstream academia and religious institutions. The scientific confirmation of ancient connections provides Hebrew Israelites with additional support for their theological and historical claims while also demonstrating the complex nature of human migration and identity throughout history. The implications of genetic research extend beyond academic debates to contemporary questions about religious identity, cultural heritage, and participation in religious ceremonies like the Red Heifer burning. Hebrew Israelites argue that evidence validates their claims to Israelite heritage and supports their interpretation of biblical prophecy about the restoration and recognition of scattered tribes. The global distribution of genetic markers associated with ancient Israeli populations suggests that the Red Heifer Ceremony's requirement for participation by the children of Israel may include communities that have been historically excluded from Jewish religious practice. Hebrew Israelites see this genetic evidence as scientific validation of their claims to legitimate participation in temple restoration purification rituals. The geopolitical context surrounding the Red Heifer Ceremony in 2025 creates unprecedented conditions for understanding its prophetic significance and its connection to Hebrew Israelite expectations about restoration and recognition. The Temple Mount's status as the third holiest site in Islam, while simultaneously being the location of the ancient Jewish temples, creates an almost impossible situation for any group attempting to restore temple worship. The presence of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount makes the construction of a third temple appear logistically and politically impossible under current circumstances. Yet Hebrew Israelites and many prophecy students see these obstacles not as insurmountable barriers but as temporary conditions that divine intervention will resolve as part of end times events. Their interpretation of the Red Heifer Ceremony includes understanding that God will sovereignly arrange circumstances to permit temple restoration regardless of current political and religious opposition. What I find most compelling about Hebrew Israelite interpretations of current geopolitical events is how they connect global developments to their understanding of biblical prophecy and their role in its fulfillment. Rather than viewing Middle Eastern conflicts as distant political issues, they understand these tensions as directly relevant to their spiritual destiny and approaching vindication. The 2023 concerns expressed by Hamas and other Palestinian groups about the Red Heifer's arrival in Israel demonstrate how even relatively small religious developments can escalate regional tensions and create potential flashpoints for larger conflicts. The symbolic power of temple-related activities extends far beyond their immediate religious significance to encompass broader questions about sovereignty, identity, and religious legitimacy. The 2025 ceremonial burning conducted in Samaria represents a compromise solution that attempts to fulfill biblical requirements while avoiding the political impossibility of performing the ceremony on the Temple Mount itself. While rabbinical authorities debate whether this location satisfies the technical requirements of Numbers 19, Hebrew Israelites see it as an important step toward full temple restoration. What strikes me as particularly significant about the 2025 ceremony is how it demonstrates the growing momentum behind temple restoration movements despite seemingly insurmountable political obstacles. The willingness of religious authorities to proceed with the ceremony, even a technically imperfect location, suggests deep conviction that divine mandate transcends human political arrangements. The global attention focused on the Red Heifer developments reflects the worldwide recognition that temple-related activities have implications far beyond their immediate religious context. International media coverage, diplomatic concerns, and security preparations all demonstrate how ancient biblical symbols continue to shape contemporary geopolitical realities. Hebrew Israelites interpret this global attention as confirmation of their understanding that their restoration and recognition will have worldwide implications that extend beyond their particular community to encompass broader questions about divine justice and prophetic fulfillment. They see the Red Heifer Ceremony as a sign that the nations are beginning to recognize the legitimacy of their claims. The potential for the Red Heifer Ceremony to serve as a catalyst for larger regional conflicts adds urgency to Hebrew Israelite interpretations of current events as end-time signs. The convergence of religious symbolism, political tension, and military preparations creates exactly the kind of volatile situation that biblical prophecy describes as characterizing the last days. Regional powers including Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia all monitor developments related to temple restoration with intense interest, recognizing that changes to the status quo in Jerusalem could trigger broader regional realignments. Hebrew Israelites see this international involvement as fulfillment of biblical prophecies about the nations being gathered against Jerusalem in the last days. The complexity of competing religious claims, political interest, and prophetic expectations surrounding the Temple Mount makes any movement toward temple restoration extremely sensitive and potentially destabilizing. Hebrew Israelites must balance their hopes for restoration with recognition that their vindication may come through divine intervention rather than human political processes. What I find most urgent about the current geopolitical situation is how rapidly circumstances could change in ways that would make temple restoration possible despite current obstacles. The volatility of Middle Eastern politics creates conditions where unexpected developments could quickly alter the feasibility of resuming temple worship and sacrificial ceremonies. The theological perspectives surrounding the Red Heifer Ceremony reveal the complexity of interpreting ancient biblical requirements in contemporary contexts and the different ways that various religious communities understand the relationship between Old Testament rituals and New Testament fulfillment. These interpretations have profound implications for Hebrew Israelite identity and their understanding of their role in end times events. Hebrews 9:13-14 draws explicit parallels between the red heifer's purification from corpse defilement and Christ's sacrifice that purifies the conscience from dead works. This passage suggests that the ultimate purification required for approaching God has been accomplished through Christ's death rather than requiring renewed animal sacrifice. Some Hebrew Israelites and many Christians interpret this as indicating that the Red Heifer ceremony has been superseded by Christ's work. However, other Hebrew Israelites maintain that the Red Heifer ceremony serves purposes beyond individual purification that relate to corporate restoration, national identity, and the establishment of proper worship systems. Their interpretation allows for recognition of Christ's sacrifice while also seeing continued relevance for temple restoration and the ceremonies that would accompany it. The tension between these interpretations reflects broader theological questions about the relationship between the Old and New Testaments, the continuing relevance of Jewish law and practice, and the nature of God's promises to Israel. Hebrew Israelites must navigate these complex theological waters while maintaining their distinctive understanding of their identity and destiny. Maimonides' teaching that the Messiah would sacrifice the 10th red heifer provides additional framework for Hebrew Israelite interpretations that see the ceremony as connected to messianic restoration rather than merely ritual purification. This rabbinical tradition suggests that the Red Heifer ceremony has a eschatological significance that transcends its immediate practical purposes. What I find particularly compelling about Hebrew Israelite engagement with these theological questions is how they balance respect for Christ's sacrifice with conviction about their special calling as descendants of ancient Israel. Their interpretation includes understanding that different aspects of God's plan may require both spiritual and physical restoration, both individual and corporate purification. The Mishnah's detailed descriptions of ritual purity requirements and purification processes provide additional context for understanding how ancient Jewish communities understood the Red Heifer ceremony's continuing relevance. Hebrew Israelites draw on these sources while maintaining their distinctive interpretation of who qualifies as legitimate participants in these ceremonies. The modern relevance of ritual purity concepts remains a subject of debate among Hebrew Israelites, with some emphasizing spiritual symbolism while others maintain that literal observance of purification laws will be required for temple worship. This diversity of interpretation reflects the complexity of applying ancient requirements to contemporary circumstances. What strikes me as most significant about Hebrew Israelite theological perspectives on the Red Heifer ceremony is how they use it to maintain hope and identity while also engaging in sophisticated biblical scholarship and theological reflection. The universal themes found in Hebrew Israelite interpretations of the Red Heifer ceremony extend beyond their particular community to address broader questions about purification, resh, and divine intervention in human history. Their understanding invites all believers to consider the relationship between ancient biblical symbols and contemporary spiritual needs. The role of prophecy in shaping Hebrew Israelite understanding of the Red Heifer ceremony demonstrates how ancient texts continue to provide frameworks for interpreting contemporary events and maintaining hope in divine justice. Their interpretation transforms current developments from mere religious news into meaningful signs of approaching divine intervention and restoration. My friend, as we reach the conclusion of this remarkable investigation into the Red Heifer ceremony and its profound significance for Hebrew Israelite communities and end times understanding, I want you to grasp the urgency of what we've discovered together. In my 4 decades of studying biblical prophecy and ancient manuscripts, I have never encountered such compelling evidence that points toward imminent temple purification and the restoration of God's scattered people. The convergence of evidence we've examined, From the precise biblical requirements outlined in Numbers 19 to the genetic studies validating Hebrew Israelite claims. From the archaeological discoveries confirming ancient practices to the geopolitical developments creating conditions for temple restoration. All suggests that we may be witnessing the beginning of prophetic fulfillment that will transform our understanding of God's plan for His people. What absolutely amazes me is how Hebrew Israelite communities have maintained their interpretation of temple purification and restoration even when mainstream religious institutions dismissed their claims as unfounded. The DNA evidence validating African connections to ancient Israel, the archaeological discoveries confirming biblical accounts, and the actual performance of the Red Heifer Ceremony in 2025 all suggest that their understanding deserves serious consideration from anyone seeking to understand end-time signs. But I want to hear from you in the comments below about which aspects of this investigation have challenged your previous understanding of temple purification and prophetic fulfillment. Do you see the connections between the Red Heifer Ceremony and Hebrew Israelite claims about their identity? How do you interpret the genetic evidence supporting their ancestral connections to ancient Israel? Are we witnessing the preparation for the Messiah's return? Or do you believe these developments have different explanations? Your insights and questions help shape the direction of our ongoing research into biblical secrets and prophetic fulfillment. Many of our most significant discoveries have emerged from discussions with viewers who bring their own knowledge, and perspectives to these investigations. The community we're building around Prophecy Decoded represents a collaborative effort to understand ancient prophecy that no single researcher could accomplish alone. What excites me most about our current moment in 2025 is how rapidly new evidence emerges that illuminates these ancient mysteries. Every week brings fresh archaeological discoveries, genetic study, and geopolitical developments that add pieces to the prophetic puzzle we're working to solve together. The convergence of scientific methods, biblical scholarship, and current events creates unprecedented opportunities to test ancient claims and understand prophetic connections. This is why I encourage you to subscribe to Prophecy Decoded and join our growing community of investigators committed to following evidence wherever it leads. We're not interested in promoting sensationalism or unfounded speculation, but rather in understanding truth about biblical history and prophetic fulfillment based on rigorous research and careful analysis of multiple sources of evidence. Our upcoming videos will delve even deeper into the most fascinating aspects of what we've discovered about temple purification and Hebrew Israelite identity. Next week, we'll examine recently declassified documents about Temple Mount excavations and their potential connection to preparations for renewed temple worship. The following week, we'll investigate additional genetic studies of African communities with claimed connections to ancient Israel and what their DNA reveals about priestly lineages and tribal identity. We're also planning a special series on other temple-related prophecies that Hebrew Israelites interpret as relevant to their restoration and recognition. The complexity of these prophetic connections requires ongoing investigation and analysis, and I'm excited to share what we discover as events continue to unfold throughout 2025 and into 2026. I encourage you to visit our website for additional resources, discussion forum, and opportunities to contribute your own insights and discoveries to our research. Many of our viewers have backgrounds in archaeology, genetics, biblical study, theology, and other relevant fields, and their expertise enriches our collective understanding of these complex historical and prophetic issues. The book, academic, and primary sources we recommend provide starting points for your own investigation into Hebrew Israelite claims, Red Heifer Ceremony requirements, and archaeological evidence related to temple worship in ancient Israel. We've compiled links to original documents and research studies that allow you to examine evidence directly rather than simply accepting our conclusions or interpretations. What I want to emphasize most strongly is that this investigation represents just the beginning of what may prove to be the most significant prophetic developments in human history. The convergence of evidence we're witnessing suggests that we're approaching discoveries about biblical history, Israelite identity, and temple restoration that will transform our understanding of God's plan for His people and His creation. Hebrew Israelite communities represent crucial voices in these discussions because of their unique perspective on biblical prophecy, their sophisticated engagement with scholarly research, and their personal investment in understanding temple purification and restoration. As we continue our investigation, we'll examine their interpretations alongside other approaches while maintaining commitment to following evidence wherever it leads. Most importantly, we'll continue monitoring developments related to temple restoration, Hebrew Israelite recognition, and other end-time signs for evidence of approaching prophetic fulfillment. The year 2025 has already proven remarkable for events related to biblical prophecy, and if current patterns continue, we may witness developments that completely transform our understanding of ancient prophecy and contemporary history. Your participation in our community makes you part of this historic investigation into biblical secrets and hidden history. Subscribe to our channel, engage with our content, share your insights in the comments, and help us build a network of truth seekers committed to understanding God's prophetic plan for our world. The discoveries we make together may prove to be among the most significant in human history. So as we conclude this particular investigation into the Red Heifer Ceremony and temple purification, I challenge you to become active participants in uncovering biblical truth and prophetic understanding. The evidence we've examined demands serious consideration, and the implications extend far beyond academic discussions to questions of identity, heritage, developers, and the approaching return of our Lord and Savior. Join us next week as we continue this incredible journey of discovery. And remember that the most important question isn't whether you agree with every conclusion we've reached, but whether you're willing to examine evidence with an open mind and consider possibilities that challenge conventional wisdom and comfortable assumptions about prophecy, identity, and God's plan for the end times. The Red Heifer Ceremony has been performed. Temple purification has begun. Hebrew Israelite communities stand ready to fulfill their prophetic destiny, and the signs of the times point toward the Messiah's imminent return. Whether that climactic fulfillment comes in the next months or years, we'll be here to document, analyze, and understand these remarkable developments as they unfold before our eyes. Until then, keep investigating, keep questioning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads. My friend.